Ну, в общем-то, тоже вещи большие.
Недостаточно высоко. Недостаточно высоко. По высоте.
А в Амазоне ты считаешь высоко?
Я думаю, что то, что между литерами, может быть, нет, там все равно поднимается.
Ну, очень чуть-чуть.
Немножко, да.
Там это гигантское.
Нет, я понимаю, да.
Примерно как западная Сибирь.
Да, у нее статус низины, конечно. Мне кажется, что Верховье нам надо подумать. Нет,
Amazonian Highlands это совсем уже другое.
Today I'm going to talk about typologies, and areality in Amazonia. So I'll start by just putting up the questions that I began with yesterday in introducing the course. So I mentioned that approaching this course from a typological perspective, we're looking at what's possible, what's probable in language, but how do we characterize what's probable or what's canonical is a big question. So in what I was talking about yesterday, I was looking more at understanding what should be understood as typical or atypical in thinking about language content and language change and language processes of multilingual dynamics of multilingual societies and the kinds of contact effects that emerge from those. And today I'm going to take a little bit more of a typological view and look at some patterns of grammatical features and phenomena that are exhibited across Amazonia, and then think about those from a typological, but also a historical and an areal perspective. So thinking about to what degree are the features that we see in these different, these typologically interesting features that we see in the region, to what degree are they regionally relevant to Amazonia, and to what degree can we actually understand their emergence as being due to language contact, and think about how they come about through language change as well. So, as I think is well known, Amazonia has a number of, exhibits a number of grammatical features in its languages that are of typological interest and have gotten quite a bit of attention from typologists. But, as I'm sure again is also well known here in this room, Amazonia has tended to be somewhat underrepresented in typological samples, at least until pretty recently, because we just simply haven't had enough robust descriptions of Amazonian languages. Happily, this is changing. There's a lot more work that's now coming to the that's emerging just in the past couple of decades. So we're getting a much better sense now of what's going on in this region. But some of the features that I'll talk about today are nominal classification, evidentiality, associated motion, and valence adjusting morphology. There are many, many others that we could talk about. So for example, constituent order that involves O before S, or A more properly. So for example, one of the Navajo languages, Nadub, which I just started working on this summer, has OSV constituent order, and it has been claimed to have that in what literature exists on the language, and from my work, it appears to be an accurate assessment of a kind of default word order for the language. But this is really rare. So in Dreyer's 2013 sample, or previous to that, but recently in the 2013 Walls, he surveyed something like 1,300 languages, and only 4 had OSV word order. So it's quite rare. And in Amazonia, there are a number of languages with some sort of OS variation of OS word order. But I won't really get into that today. There's also serial verb constructions, there's split ergativity, and particular splits that are a bit unexpected in terms of the distribution of ergative and nominative patterns or accusative patterns between subordinate and main clauses. So Spike Gilday, for example, has worked on this quite a bit. So many possible features to discuss. I'm only going to talk about the first 4. But in discussing this, I want to we'll look at questions about how these features are areally distributed, and to what extent we can relate their existence to processes of contact-driven elaboration and grammaticalization. So just trying to think a little bit about to what extent do they exhibit areality and how do they get the way they are. And some of the material that I'll be presenting draws on joint work with Adam Tallman, who's he was a PhD student at UT Austin with me, and just recently graduated with a really fabulous grammar on Voronovo, which is a Minoan language. So he and I have been working on some of these issues together. So let's start off with nominal classification. So we have a lovely example from Christina's poster of exactly the questions that I'll be talking about here. So if you haven't seen her poster, it gives a really nice overview of some of the same issues that I'll be bringing up. So just the 3 sort of noteworthy characteristics of Amazonian classification systems, and I'll go over each of these in a bit more detail. First of all, there tend to be large or open systems. So many of the Amazonian languages that have classifier systems exhibit really large sets of classifiers, and these systems that have been called repeater classifier systems, where you can have essentially what appear to be fully formed nouns that can appear in the classifier position in the language and behave as classifiers, but there's a kind of fluidity between what could be understood as a fully full noun on its own versus something that's being used as a classifier. These systems also exhibit both derivational functions and agreement functions, so it's very common that languages will have both of these functions. And so earlier work on Amazonian non-classifier systems, like Greenwald and Seifert paper, for example, talks about these kinds of systems as being as something that we can understand as being not only typologically intermediate between what we might understand as more canonical classifier systems and noun class systems, but also maybe understood as sort of diachronically transitional. I think that in recent years people have questioned the idea more that they might be diachronically transitional, because this sort of what we would say typologically looks like an intermediate system is actually very robust and very stable. It appears to be very robust and very stable in this part of the world. So it's more that Amazonia is offering us a new perspective on how we understand the typology of classification more generally, rather than certain languages just being in the middle somewhere. And finally, a lot of classifier systems in this part of the world exhibit flexible class environment. So you get the same set of classifiers that it can appear in multiple environments. So it can be hosted by different kinds of word classes, for example. So beginning with the idea of large and open sets, here's an example from a Tukano language Tatuyu from Gomez and Bear's work, but Christina had a really nice example from Waikana, which is very similar, that you have these really big sets of classifiers, and essentially they go from elements that are very grammaticalized, that are not identifiable with another noun in the language, all the way to elements that look, in many cases, identical to the nouns that they're associated with. So in this case, for example, these ones on the top left, from general, so really just generic, cylindrical, rounded, tubular, so on. These aren't clearly associable with another noun, quite grammaticalized, and you can see, phonologically they're short. But then you start getting into the ones down on the right, or the lower right, and you start to get forms that match their corresponding nouns. So the classifier for house is identical in form to the noun for house. And then you get all the way from there into the so-called repeater classifiers, where in some cases it really seems that that a form is just being a noun that's being used in a classifier slot rather than something that's to be understood as a more dedicated classifier. In other words, there's more flexibility in how they're used. So the tendency towards large and open sets is really prevalent in this part of the world. So Krasnokova's survey in 2012, where she looked at noun phrase features in a sample of 55 Amazonian languages, mostly in the western region, she found that most of the languages that she looked at that had classifier systems at all had very large sets. And of these, most of these are actually open sets, so very much like what we just saw. So there's a graph of her findings, and you can see it's really a pretty strong majority that have these large sets. What about functions? So here's an example from Bora, from Frank Zeffart's work, that exhibits both derivational and agreement functions of classifiers in this language. And again, this kind of pattern is fairly common, although languages vary in terms of how much functional load is on one or the other. Most of the Amazonian languages that I've looked at with respect to classifier systems do have both of these functions, but in some cases the agreement function is very marginal, but in other cases it's more evenly split. Or in some cases the agreement function is really important. But here you can see, for example, if you take a generic term like banana, you add a classifier, and you can specify whether you're talking about the fruit, or a bunch, or a tree, or a leaf, or whatever associated with the banana plant. In some cases, you can leave the classifier off. In the languages that I'm most familiar with, there's a default interpretation of just the banana term as normally just referring to the fruit, with or without the classifier. But if you want to specify other parts of the banana plant, it's more important to include the derivational classifier. But many nouns, the noun itself doesn't appear with the classifier at all. And you would just have the classifiers functioning for agreement and, in many cases, a kind of reference tracking function. So here's an example from Bora of the agreement function. So here, the classifier is, again, performing a derivational function here, essentially, where the word for axe is metal, basically round thing made out of metal round thing. So I don't recall the specifics of Bora, but presumably you could put other classifiers here with the word metal, and you would get other kinds of nouns that wouldn't mean axe, they'd mean other implements. But then you have, and you can see in the verb in this language, both the verb and the demonstrative agree with take the classifier as well, so have this agreement. If this were a noun that wasn't derived by a classifier, then you would presumably be an example of the agreement function without the classifier appearing with the noun itself. So here's a map from Kostokova's work from the sales database of languages where classifiers perform a derivational function. And you can see that there are a large number that have where it performs a very clear derivational function, and that these areas cluster. So she identifies these two clusters where you have classifiers with the derivational function. The agreement function also seems to cluster in about the same place. So you can see again, there are a lot of languages that are doing both, using classifiers for both. And we do get this clustering of classifier systems in these two parts of Amazonia, which is something that she highlights. So another feature of nominal classification systems here is flexible class assignments. So Eichenwald, for example, has talked about these as Eichenwald and Kostakova have used terms like multiple and multifunctional classifier systems. But the idea is simply that you can get the classifier appearing on all sorts of different elements in the clause, typically with either an agreement function or sometimes a more sort of reference tracking related function. Argue for either of those. My understanding is that in Teriana and that in other languages in the region, this sort of structure that you get where the classifiers appearing on practically every element are possible, but in many cases there's an optional element here in that you wouldn't necessarily have, in normal discourse, you wouldn't necessarily have the classifier appearing on every element of the clause this way. This is the kind of thing you could get in elicitation, probably not in natural discourse. On the other hand, when you get into the more grammaticalized classifiers, you're more likely to find multiple repetitions of this. So there's a fair amount of flexibility in terms of the co-occurrence of classifiers depending on where they are in a kind of grammaticalization continuum that's represented by this big set of classifiers. But here you can see it's occurring. It's occurring on all the elements of the noun phrase, and I guess this is a copyless.
It just takes some 2/3 of the phonological material of the clause.
Yeah, that's right. But as I said, my understanding of Teriana and definitely the other languages that I've looked at more closely, this wouldn't be a normal utterance. Again, if it was one of these very highly grammaticalized classifiers, then you would see more repetitions of it, presumably. But it's possible. And I guess part of the point is that you could get it on any one of these elements, even if you're not going to get it on all at once, very likely, you could get it on all of them. Any questions so far?
Well, I think I want to ask a question. Well, it's really striking how superficially how the classifier systems in Amazon really are similar to well, the noun classes in the Niger Congo languages, in particular in Bantu, and in particular I'm wondering whether classifiers in any Amazonian languages can have pronominal functions. Can have pronominal functions. Like an aphoric.
That's a good question. From what I'm familiar with, the closest thing would be to have a demonstrative plus a classifier, and that could have a pronominal function, but that you wouldn't have the classifier normally standing on its own. Do you have a question, okay?
Yeah, I was wondering if you have a structure like this, where the classifier can technically be on each element, where is it usually? Because it's usually only on one or a few, right?
Well, yeah. So in Hoop, for example, you could get a structure something like this. You would be more likely to get it on an element that's focused. So if you're emphasizing, if the focus is more on one of these constituents, that's more likely where you would find it. Yeah. Anybody else?
A very small technical note. I think that in the discussion of flexibility of class and gender systems, they usually refer to the phenomenon called derivational function as flexible class assignment. This is my memory. So when they say that, for instance, classifier systems in Southeast Asia are flexible, they are saying basically that the same noun may occur with different classifiers in different construction, which is much more functional, similar to what we call derivational function. Even if it's not exactly derivational function, it's more on this function side. I have to check, but I have this memory.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, that's a good point. So in that case, these systems would exhibit flexibility, both derivationally and this kind of multifunctional flexibility in terms of agreement as well. Yeah. So what about nominal classification and areality? So as you can see from these maps, visually it looks like a pretty evident areal component here in the way these systems are clustering. And in more focused, kind of localized discussions of the phenomenon, for example, Seifert and Payne noticed that there's very close correspondence, sometimes very specific types of structures involving nominal classification among languages in this upper left area. So you can see there's a kind of cluster right in the Upper Rio Negro region that we were talking about yesterday, and then some of the languages around there, not all of which happen to be in Cosmicova's sample, by the way. So Witatoan, for example, I believe it doesn't appear unless that one of those dots is kind of a Western attestation of it. But Seifert and Payne look at some of these systems in this region more closely and observe that there's some really close correspondences among the structures. And they, like Costakova, they point to the possibility of areal diffusion as being responsible for these patterns. Eichenwald has talked about how in the northeastern part of South America there's been apparent diffusion of possessed classifier constructions from Caravan languages into northern Arawakan languages in that region. And in the Chaco region, there's some interesting stuff going on with possessive classifiers. In particular, something that looks like an interesting areal feature in that region related to possessive classifiers that are specifically for domesticated animals. So this example from Pilaga here shows that classifier in that language. But you get these possessive classifiers for domesticated animals in a bunch of these languages in that region. So it doesn't look accidental for what that's worth. So how do these things get elaborated? Well, there's three possible ways that you can get change or restructuring or elaboration or restructuring in classifier systems that can be relevant to contact. So you can get contact-driven elaboration or development of systems where systems are expanded or in fact emerge clearly from through language internal grammaticalization processes that can be involved by contact. Then you can get existing systems that are just restructured. So for example, the semantic values can get moved around. And in some cases, you can get the direct borrowing of classifier forms. So we'll look at each of these phenomena. So elaboration of systems. So clearly this idea of repeater classifiers that we see examples of this in so many of these languages, it provides a really obvious avenue by which systems can be elaborated. And essentially, if you have a system that ends up being an open class, clearly there's sort of unlimited room for elaboration. So you can suck nouns into this classifier slot, these classifier slots. They can become used in these classifier slots. The more often a given noun might turn up in one of these classifier slots, the more likely you are to have its grammaticalization, and will then drive it towards being a more dedicated classifier form. right? So that's presumably what's happened in Tatuyu, in Waikana, in Christina's work, that you just have this cycle of, or presumably you have a cycle of elements that are becoming potentially more grammaticalized, but new elements coming in whenever they're needed. Also, the association between the derivational function of classifiers and noun compounding provides a route for classifier systems to come about through the grammaticalization of what can be understood as generic noun nouns. So Payne talks about this for Yava, Facunis gives some examples, some relevant examples for Ospina, Ospina for Yukup, and I'll show you in a minute an example from Hoop. And as Eichenwald has said, has expressed, the more lexicosyntactic the noun categorization is, the easier it is to diffuse. So in other words, when you have these systems where some of the forms are essentially nouns or akin to nouns, the more easy you might imagine the diffusion to be. So Hoop, I think, gives a really nice example of the process of the development of the classifier system through compounding, and this is a case that I've looked at in detail. So it seems that in Hoop, there's a what I would have called an incipient classifier system. So there's a set of the elements that get used as classifiers in very much the same way as we saw in some of the other examples, although the agreement function is more marginal, but it's there, it's just more marginal. The derivational function is more important in Hoop. All of these noun classifier forms are transparently related to nouns for parts of plants, or most of them. So here, for example, you can see the derivational function. You get this word for fruit, combining with avocado, and you get avocado fruit. You get the word for tree, combining with avocado, or the classifier form for tree, or bound noun for tree, combining with avocado, and you get avocado tree. These forms for fruit and tree can be characterized as bound nouns in the sense that they don't appear by themselves. They have to appear with, hosted by some other element. But they have been undergone semantic extensions so that the form that is associated with fruits also means round things in general. The form that's associated with trees also means long, thin things, and as we'll see another example of in a little bit, it also means just things in general. So it's become a generic form. Then you also get the combination of these classifier elements with verb roots, and then you get an even more clearly derivational function where you get nominalizations that relate the activity expressed by the verb to the entity that's expressed in these generic semantic terms by the classifier form. So if you take the verb for write, and you add the bound noun taken to it, you get taken, which is a pencil. And the really, really cool thing that I think is really awesome about this process in Hoop is that you can look at this set of classifier forms and what's been going on with them. And what it looks like has happened is that Hoop started out with a set of plant part terms that's used as a kind of generic classifying form or derivational form to express. So in other words, it has this derivational function to express parts of plants, but that also has a function of classifying different kinds of material entities that involve plants that you might use for things. So just as an avocado leaf describes, derives a certain kind of part of the avocado plant, it also allows you to talk about different kinds of leaves, right? So you can have an avocado leaf, you can have a banana leaf, and so on, which are all things that have different uses. So in this part of the world, plants and plant parts are one of the main things that you make things out of. And so then what you get is, so you start getting these very productive kinds of compounding strategies based on this derivational function. Then you have this whole influx of objects, material objects from the non-indigenous world coming in that need names. So in some cases, the name might just get borrowed from Portuguese, but most of the time, people innovate a new name, and that innovation is very, very easy to do, done very productively take the verb and you add the classifying form. So essentially what you get is, so forms like peg meaning shaft. There are quite a number of native implements that involve shafts, or in some cases just generic things, that have this sort of form where you have the verb and you have the tagging form, meaning shaft. But there's lots and lots and lots of things like pencils and so on that come from the outside world that now have conventionalized names that have been innovated by this strategy. And in certain cases, it looks like the semantic extension has in fact been propelled by all of these things coming in from outside. So in the case of the leaf form, which isn't on this list, the word for leaf is used to talk about different kinds of leaves, or leaves for doing different things within the native world. But now it's also used to talk about all different kinds of books and papers. So you have a semantic extension from leaf to paper, which of course is fairly natural, right? So in English, you can talk about a leaf of paper, in Portuguese, a folha. So it's fairly natural, but in this case, that extension appears to have been motivated specifically by the arrival of books and paper. So now, a hoodcat, so a write paper or write leaf, is a notebook. You can have various kinds of things like that. So it seems that this is a kind of classifier system that I would say it's incipient, but it shares most of the same sorts of functions of classifiers that are more established in Tupi-known languages. So the derivational function, but also the agreement function, although as I said in Hoop it's a bit more marginal. But you get the reference tracking function of these things, I think is quite clear. And the semantic extensions, as I said, seem to have been really pushed forward, sort of put into overdrive by all of these things coming in from the outside world that need names. So it's a really interesting case, sort of all sorts of contact and change happening from different motivations. So this would be an example of a system being elaborated or even developed, perhaps. Although the roots of the system were there already, but it's definitely been pushed into what would be more like a regional noun classifier system more recently, I think. But we can also look at examples of restructuring systems, where you have systems already in place, but the semantic values get moved around. So in the Upper Rio region, we've got these two language families, Tupi-known and Arawakan. They both have noun classifier systems, but there's a little semantic disconnect in how the systems work on general terms. So in Tupi-known languages, animates are classified by animacy or gender, and inanimates are classified by shape. In Arawakan languages, it's the same thing, but for non-human animates, they go to shape rather than animacy or gender. So with respect to non-human animates, there's a mismatch between the two systems. But if we look at cases of contact between Tupi-known and Arawakan languages, we see a realignment of that non-human animate classification. So Tariana, which has undergone lots of contact from Tucano, you can see that if you talk about a snake, a big snake in Tariana, you use the animate classifier. Whereas in Voronovo, which is Tariana's sister language, you use the shape classifier. So the Tariana system obviously matches the Tucano one, whereas Voronovo would be the Arawakan pattern that Tariana presumably moved away from. Here's an example of a change in the opposite direction. So in the eastern part, or sorry, the more western part of the region, there's intermarriage, some intermarriage between Arawak and Voronovo people and Tupi-known and Cubeo people. And in this case, Gomez and Ver has shown that in some examples of Cubeo, there's another reorganization that's matching the Arawakan pattern. So here in Cubeo, paca is an animal, a very tasty animal. And in Cubeo, it's being classified by shape. So again, a move from the Tupi-known system to the Arawakan one in this particular case. And there are various examples of this sort of thing. So finally, direct borrowing of classifier forms talking about yesterday is that there doesn't seem to be very much borrowing of form in Amazonian languages. So I mentioned that, for example, basic vocabulary loan levels are quite low and appear to be significantly low compared to other world regions. And in these regions specifically, they're all described as having low levels of lexical borrowing. And yesterday, one of the things we talked about was that the speakers appear to be, relatively aware of phonological forms of morphemes and avoid the direct borrowing of those forms. However, an interesting caveat on that is that it seems that classifier forms are more frequently borrowed, which also can be an issue for questions of language classification, because sometimes classifier forms are included in lists of basic vocabulary in terms of because of the proximity to full nouns. So sometimes it looks like you've got a list of basic vocabulary where things are being borrowed, but it turns out these are actually, arguably being used in their classifier function or have a strong classifier function. So in all three of these regions, the Capitán Putumayo, in Frank Zeifert's work, in the Upper Rio Negro, and the Guacara Mamoré, we have examples of direct borrowing of classifier forms, even where borrowing of other lexical material or morphological phonological material is low. So here's an example from Frank Zeifert's work of borrowing of noun class and gender markers in Hezigaro, which is an Arawakan language in context with Bora. And you can see that he's offered reconstructions of the Bora forms. The Hezigaro forms are very clearly borrowed from Bora because Hezigaro is Arawakan. These forms are not present in other Arawakan languages, so the directionality is quite clear. And the borrowing is also quite clear. The forms match pretty closely. So Frank has done a lot of work on this and shown that really a massive part of the system appears to have been directly taken over. Catherine Bolaños has also looked at borrowing in Kakwa, in the Upper Rio Negro region, where a number of classifiers appear to have been borrowed directly from Arawakan or Tupinamba languages. There are a few hints of that in Hoot as well. Here's in the Guacara Mamoré languages, work by Hein Vandenborg. So he shows, here you've got 3 isolates, a Macro-J language and an Ambipara language, so all different language families, but there are a whole lot of close matches in classifier forms. So again, it's a really interesting question. Why is it that if people are resisting borrowing, why are you getting direct borrowing of classifiers? And especially, again, relating to our discussion yesterday about things that appear to contradict our general assumptions about how borrowing takes place, this would be an example where you're resisting lexical borrowing with borrowing morphology, right? So it seems very strange. Why this is the case, I have a couple of thoughts about why you might get direct borrowing of classifier forms, but let me throw it out there to you. Does anybody have any ideas? Yeah.
For instance, if we recall these examples with lots of classifiers appearing in different places of the sentence, it's, I would even say it's sort of playing with an aesthetic function of language. Like it's fun, it's cool to have these things, and they are certainly employed in all sorts of verbal rituals, aren't they?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So it's not about lexicon and probably not even about grammar. It's about the way of speaking.
Yeah, it's sort of like a rhythm, almost like prosody. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about it. Yeah.
Maybe we could just say that there's intensive contact and intensive borrowing, but just lexicon stays apart because of the linguistic ideological reasons. So somehow it's a special domain where contact and use change does not apply or apply less than in other domains, and just spared for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, but then I think that's still, it still raises the question of why, right? Why would lexicon be avoided? And one of the arguments for why that we talked about yesterday was the idea that lexicon is just more consciously manipulable. And grammatical structures, for example, are more likely to slip in under the radar. But with reference to that point, there are two things that come to my mind, two additional possible explanations. So one would be that, if you recall, yesterday we looked at examples of verb roots that get borrowed. And I pointed out that in Hoop and some of the other area languages like Tariana, it seems that of the borrowings that are coming in from Tucano, you actually have more verb roots than you get noun roots, which is, again, typologically strange. One explanation for that is that the verb roots are often buried in these really long complex forms, and so it's easy to slip in one little borrowed verb root in this long native complex. So, maybe relevant to your point, Maria, that could be one part of the explanation as well, to why classifiers get borrowed in, because they're part of these complex nominal constructions. One other possible reason that I was thinking of is that they have part of the agreement function here really relates very strongly to reference tracking. And for example, Jeroen Matras, in his work on language compact, he's shown that discursive elements like function words that are relevant to kind of manipulating the information flow in discourse are often more susceptible to borrowing. And so it occurs to me there might be a connection here with classifiers. Peter, did you want to add something?
Yes,
Or somebody?
yes. Exactly. But I think I wasn't intended to speak about it, as we regard nominal classifiers as not just a part of morphology, but discourse organizers. So, as far as I know, such discourse particles and interjections are very readily developed. For example, from Russian to minor languages, like discourse particle to or some interjections.
So you said they're likely to be borrowed or not likely to be borrowed? Did you say they're more likely to be borrowed or not? I didn't understand.
Yes. They are very likely to be borrowed.
More likely to be borrowed.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great.
Items that organize your discourse.
Yeah, exactly. So that could be, again, one explanation for the classifiers being borrowed is that they're relevant to the organization of discourse. So they're not interjections, obviously, but they're involved in reference tracking, so they're very discursively involved.
Well, I would only try to make a caveat. I think that I don't think it's really possible to come up with with an answer to this sort of question, which would be sort of overarching and working for all, sort of a universal. I don't think it's possible because we have too much contradictory evidence. Like in this particular context situation, something happens, and in another context situation, precisely the opposite happens. And so I think the only real way to explain things, different ways of understanding what explanation is. But in this case, I think it's really essential to try to connect it to the social context and the way language is used.
I completely agree. Yeah, but I do think that there's something that one can do by looking at the particular social context and the particular structural context and thinking about how those might intersect. And that the fact that there's so many variables on both of those levels, that would be one way of understanding why we get so many different outcomes in different context situations, but that we might be able to think about the intersection of those two domains. So that would be the point here, would be that there's a structural function of classifiers here that isn't quite so common maybe in other languages, and there's this social situation where, as you point out, there might be a discursive relevance in in sort of a kind of rhythm of discourse or something. There's also the fact that people do appear to be resisting loans of some kinds that are more, arguably maybe more salient, but other things are more likely to slip in. So I would say that maybe looking at all those things together could help us think about it. Okay. Any more questions about classifiers? Okay, I want to move on to tense systems. So Amazonian tense systems, also some typologically noteworthy characteristics. So again, we tend to find a lot of really elaborate systems, especially in Western Amazonia. We also have some evidence in various languages of fairly low selectivity. So tense markers are often noted as having auxiliary-like functions, and sometimes are not clearly hosted by a verb, for example, or some other element. So we'll see examples of that. So graded systems. Typology is a good example of a really complex graded tense system. So it's got 7 tense distinctions, from hodiernal tense all the way down to remote past. And in this example, you can just see how they work. So they're associated with the verb here, as is typical tense, but quite a complex system. Mueller's 2013 survey of tense in Amazonian languages points out that remoteness distinctions are pretty common. So in her survey, she looked at 5 different tense values, and you can see a majority of the languages, or a large proportion of the languages, have at least 3 to 4 tense distinctions. Well, I guess that would really be 4 to 5 if present is encoded as 0. So multiple tense distinctions. Here's a map from Voronovo that gives a similar sort of visualization. So you can see that there are some areal clusterings of relatively complex tense systems in terms of remoteness distinctions, and one of those does appear to be particularly this northwest area of Amazonia with respect to their sample. So they talk about having both present and 4 or more remoteness distinctions, or between 3 and 4 remoteness distinctions. And you can see this bunch of those here, I guess between 2 and 4. So lots of elaborate systems. The question of low selectivity or bonding. So this is something that Adam Tallman has looked at in some detail. In Chocobo has some good examples of this. So Tallman points out that in Chocobo, for example, your graded tense forms are normally bound, so they normally occur with a host. But when they're not adjacent to a verb, so they normally attach to a verb, they're normally bound to a verb, as again you would expect for tense. But when they can occur separate from the verb, and when this happens, they project their own prosodic word. So they're sort of acting like what you might want to call a particle or something. As you can see in B here. There's something like this too. I don't think I have an example of it here, but there's, if you recall yesterday, I talked a little bit about these 2 sort of particles that are associated with tense. They're phonologically free elements. They're very optional. They usually follow a verb, but they can do all sorts of other things. You can even have these tense markers appear as themselves be inflected and act as demonstratives. So this form pah, which means recent past, I can use it, I can say pahapi, which would be past form, dependent marker, dependent suffix, and masculine classifier form. And that would mean like that guy that I recently saw, or I recently interacted with, or whatever, was recently mentioned.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Is it possible to analyze such forms like criticized adverbs or something like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. In some cases, maybe, but they don't pattern like normal adverbs in the language. So as far as other temporal adverbs, they have a different kind of there's a different patterning with respect to position in the clause. Other clearly temporal adverbs don't associate with the verb in the same way. So these, in some cases, so like in hoop, for example, the pa form appears to reconstruct as a past marker. It appears to have always had some sort of phonologically free sort of particle quality all the way back to Voronovo, as far as we can tell. But the remote past marker hoop does appear to be derived from a temporal adverb meaning yesterday, but it now has a discrete identity from that temporal adverb meaning yesterday, which still exists in the language. So I think there's a connection, but I think there's an argument that they're also distinct. But in some languages, it might not always be that clear. Okay, so what about context and elaboration of tense systems? We have some evidence in some Amazonian languages about where these systems, where some of the elaboration has come from. So in Hein van der Voort's work in the Wapare region in southwest Amazonia, he looks at Aikana and Wai and talks about how the quotative construction in both of these languages has given rise to a future tense construction. And he argues that this is a contact-driven pattern because the same transition has happened in these two adjacent and unrelated languages. Mueller observes that in, for example, in western Amazonia and Peru, Kokama, which is a Tupi-Guaranian language, and neighboring Minoan languages have undergone parallel, or exhibit very parallel and very elaborate systems. In the Valpes languages, as I just mentioned, we have pretty clear evidence of contact-driven grammaticalization of tense as well. So, as I said, you have evidence that this one past tense marker reconstructs the whole not tense system. There's evidence for one past marker reconstructing, but the past and the recent and distant past distinction in hoop is clearly a recent addition. So as I said, the distant past comes from this adverb. And the future suffix is also a recent addition to hoop grammar. So that in itself is a really interesting example of grammaticalization. So I'll go through it quite quickly, but if you're interested, there's a written version of this. Okay, so how did this happen in hoop? How do we know that this is recent? Well, I think that there's a clear grammaticalization path that shows where it comes from, but it's a very, very interesting one. It's not what you would expect. Okay, so here's in A, here's an example of the future tense suffix. So we but hang, who's going to do some work? Now we have an identical form, hang, which means stick, right? So you might remember seeing this in the noun classifier examples. Stick, firewood, or when it's attached to, when it is acting as a noun classifier, it means shaft or tree. So here, used by itself, carry firewood for me. Okay, completely different semantically, completely different morphosyntactically, obviously no relationship, right? Well, hang on. Okay. You may not believe me, but it did get past review, so. Alright, so what you get here's some interesting intermediate examples. So you get this same noun thing occurring in compounds, meaning tree or stick, that's associated with this particular kind of plant, right? So this is the point about it acting as a bound noun relating to plant parts, just like other things like leaf and fruit. So in C, we have Brazil nut tree or stick of Brazil nut tree wood, do the thing. So from there, we get this use that, as I mentioned, is general for these plant part terms that are sort of incipient classifiers, where they can also appear with verb stems and derive a nominalization relating to something made out of wood that's used for this, like a stick that's used for this activity. So the word for flute is a stick used to play flute music or to play music. But of course, in today's world, this can apply to things that are just long and thin and don't have to be made out of wood. Another point that I already mentioned is that there's a subsequent semantic generalization, or we would assume it's subsequent, where this stick classifier form or bound noun form can also just mean a generic thing in general. So it can be applied to entities where there's no clear long, thin shape. And it's the only one of these classifier forms that's developed this really generic function. So, for example, headphones, when I first arrived in the Book community, I don't think very many people knew what headphones were, but you know, they obviously figured it out very quickly, and they came up with this term, which, as far as I could tell, was a kind of one-off that became established very quickly. So here's the interesting part. So in discourse, you can find examples like this where the interpretation of the verb root plus this taken form is ambiguous between a nominalization relating to something for doing something and a purpose adverbial clause. So in this example from the story, he says he placed them in the canoe, his food supplies, in order to eat them when he emerged again. Or you could analyze it as what he would eat when he emerged again. So you can see that there's good grounds here for reanalysis. Structurally, it's essentially the same. It's the same construction, and the pragmatics gives the possibility for either interpretation. So the argument is that this was the bridging context where you get from the nominal function to a verbal function. And of course, as is well known, it's easy to get from a purpose clause to a future tense, from purpose semantics to future tense. It's also fairly well known, or fairly common, that you have these processes of what Nick Evans has called insubordination, where you get a subordinate clause developing a main clause function. So the argument would be that you went from this purpose adverbial to the possibility of a main clause future construction. And interestingly, in Hoop, all of these functions and uses of this form are still maintained. So it's a pretty visible trail. And then you get some phonological reduction. So now, principally when it's used as a future marker rather than a purpose marker, you get constructions like this, where you lose the final consonant. So that's the story about where the future tense comes from in Hoop. Whether you believe it or not. That's my story. Okay, any questions about tense? Yes?
And this until is a different thing.
Yes, that's a different thing. I think that's actually a Portuguese borrowing. Speaking of borrowed function words, which, by the way, presumably didn't come directly from Portuguese. It's present in all of the Baltic languages. You've probably seen it all the time. No? It's in Catholic, I think. But te presumably comes from ate. And it's one of the only kinds of forms in Hoop that's used clause initially like this as well. So there are various reasons to think it's a little, but it appears to be different. Anything else? Okay. Evidentiality. So here, again, we talked about this a bit yesterday. But typologically noteworthy characteristics. Again, some really elaborate systems in this region. There's also a frequent association between evidentiality and tense, such that in some cases it's not really clear, or it's debated whether tense is really primarily, or the marking of temporality in the verb phrase is really marking grounding the timing of the evidential, when the information was determined, versus when the event actually happened. So elaborate systems are present pretty widely in the Americas, but Western Amazonia seems to be particularly prone to elaborate systems. In the Valpez languages, as we've already seen, there's a pretty elaborate set of 4 to 5 categories. So some of they're quite elaborate in global perspective. But other Amazonian languages, such as Karo, also have elaborate systems, and in some cases, there's a lot going on with modality too that seems to kind of overlap with evidentiality, and sometimes you have a large set of of values, and where you might draw a line between modality and evidentiality isn't always that clear. Here's a map from Dehan, from Walls online, that shows the evidential systems, and again you can see a lot going on in the Americas, but particularly a lot of pretty complex stuff going on here in Amazonia, particularly Western Amazonia. Here's another example of just how crazy it can get. So in Matse's, as Fleck's 2007 article discusses in detail, there's a really complex system of evidentiality intents, where the values are merged in this whole paradigm of boundwords, of verbal suffixes. So you can see it gets pretty complicated. So what about contact-driven elaboration? Mueller talks about regional clusters where elaborate evidential systems are particularly well represented. So again, sort of, at least circumstantial evidence for areality. Knepels and Van der Voort have talked about evidential systems as being contact-driven, or at least areally relevant in the Guavaré-Mamoré region. And of course, in the Valpes, Eichenwald has talked about the development of evidentiality in Terriana that's been pushed by Tucanoan, contact with Tucanoan. And as we've already seen, there's a similar story for Hoop and Uhu. So as I said yesterday, it looks pretty clear that these categories have been elaborated. And that point is evident in Hoop and Uhu, both because of what we can reconstruct for Proto-Nanahoop, which is only one value, same as Eichenwald's pointed out for Terriana, where you can only reconstruct the reported for the local Arab languages as well. But it's also evident in Hoop and Uhu and in Terriana by the fact that you can see the grammaticalization trail for the elaboration of the other values in the system. So it's clearly that there's a very evident argument for the recent innovation. And I don't have a ton of time, but I'll show you quickly what that is for Hoop. For one of the evidentials. And the others have similar trails, but I won't get into them in the interest of time. So in Hoop and in other Valpes languages, you have these long verb compounds, right? And these compounds provide all kinds of opportunity for grammaticalization. You get verbal roots that are strung together, and there are many, many examples of verb roots that are developing functions as they're essentially turning into verbal suffixes relating to tense, aspect, mode, evidentiality in the context of these verb compounds. So that seems to be what's happened in this case. We have a verb in A. You can see there's a verb root that's perfectly good as an independent verb root in Hoop that means make noise or make sound. So the example in A shows you how that works. It also appears in verb compounds like any other self-respecting verb root. So in B, you've got a sentence, don't make so much noise singing. And so you've got the verb sing, and then you've got the verb make noise, and then the rest of the clause. So here in C, we have evidence for a reanalysis or for ambiguity of bridging context between the make sound interpretation and a more evidential interpretation. So here again, it's a sentence from a story where somebody says, go fetch a pashuba tree hollow. So this is a sort of big thing that fell off of a palm tree that they're going to use for something. And he says, the one that just fell. And you can interpret this whole form here as it fell making noise, or it fell and I heard it fall. So it's really ambiguous here between the verb interpretation and the evidential interpretation. And morphosyntactically, this is a slot that is licensed for an evidential. An evidential can appear here as if it were a kind of compound final verb suffix. However, the evidentials in Hoop also have an appearance as a kind of verbal enclitic that gets thrown away, that are put on at the end of the verb and is unstressed and means various definitions of eclitic, I guess. But this is morphosyntactically distinct from this suffix form, but they're both ways that the evidential can appear. So, so the rest of the story would be that you get other contexts where only the evidential interpretation is really prominent. So evidence for an extension of this evidential analysis. And then how does it turn into an enclitic? So here's an example of it appearing as a verbal enclitic in F. That's a bit of a tricky part of the story, right? Because normally in grammaticalization we think about things becoming more bound rather than less bound. Here the argument is that it's actually detaching. But I think that this can be justified or explained if we understand that evidentials are in fact increasing scope over the whole clause, the whole utterance. And where we do see examples in cross-linguistic accounts of grammaticalization of things becoming less bound in the grammaticalization process, it tends to be associated with an increase in scope. So that seems to be relevant here. The other way that this could happen structurally is that you get an extension of this evidential from verbal predicates to nominal predicates. So now in loop, these evidentials can appear with verbal predicates or nominal predicates or adjectival predicates. Basically, they can appear with any predicate, but they have to follow the predicate. With nouns, you don't have a difference. In the nominal template, you don't have a difference between a suffix slot and an evidential slot. That difference is only relevant to verbs. So one way this could have happened was that as scope increases, these things get associated with nominal predicates, and then in that association, they develop this sort of desuffixized existence. And then perhaps they could re-associate with verbal context as this more disassociated or less bound element. Yeah?
I had a question about example D. So that is also the non-visual evidential, right? But I don't really understand how this fits into the non-visual semantics.
Oh, okay, good question. Right. So that is also relevant to the process of semantic extension here. So in Hoop and in the other Valpes languages, if you see something visually, if you experience something through visual sight, you would use the visual category, which in Hoop in many cases is unmarked. If you experience something directly, but not visually, that's the domain of the non-visual evidential. So the argument here with respect to grammaticalization would be that it started out as being audible, which is the way that these things are usually used, right? So if you experience something directly, but non-visually, in the context of this society at least, and maybe you could make a more general case, that usually means you're hearing it. But you can also use this evidential if you're smelling something or tasting something, or in rare cases, like this is a fairly unusual example, but this is also a robust use, if you're expressing an internal feeling or opinion. So like if you're talking about something that you feel but don't hear or see, like if somebody pokes you in the back, or if you're talking about something that you smell, you would use this form.
So this feeling can also be something emotional, for example.
Yeah, which is, as I said, is fairly, it's not the most common use of the form, but occasionally when people are emphasizing that this is their own internal feeling or opinion, they'll use this form.
I have a small question, maybe I missed part of the logic, but how do we know that examples like E, the non-verbal uses, appear after the grammaticalization of the suffix of the verb? So you are assuming detaching here, while it could go parallel ways. It could be becoming complicit, which would be relatively free in terms of its host, class of host, and suffixing to the verb. And then you would not need to posit this very typical story about first suffix, then degrammaticalization in the eclectic, and then coming back on the verb. So there could be two parallel paths taken by the same marker.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I quite followed your question. So you're saying that...
How do we know that example E appeared in Hoop after the stage D has been reached?
Oh, I see. So why wouldn't this be the verb enclosizing directly to the noun or something like that?
Yeah, why do you consider E as an extension of D rather than a different path of grammaticalization of the same marker?
Yeah, okay, good question. Right, so the other alternative would be that this was somehow object-verb construction where the verb ended up becoming encliticized to the object and turned into a predicate nominal construction. Yeah, I think that's a possibility, but there's other internal evidence in Hoop for the process that I talked about where there's lots and lots and lots of cases of verb roots grammaticalizing within compounds, and there are a few other cases where it looks like they may have moved out, whereas there's no other examples of a process like this happening. So there just doesn't seem to be good language internal evidence that the process of the verb encliticizing to the noun and turning into a predicate nominal has happened. But I think it's definitely a plausible possibility. I don't see a trail for that in the language, whereas the other trails are pretty well attested. Yes.
Can this home thing, when it's still used as a verb, mean something like to smell, not only to make noise, but only...
No, yeah, so that's evidence of the semantic extension that's accompanying the grammaticalization. Yeah, as a verb, and as far as I've been able to ascertain, it only means to hear, make, well, to make noise.
There's another question.
Yes.
Yes, for example, D is rather ambiguous because it can be understood as just non-visual, like an inner sense, and it can be as well understood as an inferential. So my question is if Hoopa has other values like inferential, initiative.
You mean are there other evidential values in Hoop?
Yes.
Yeah, so these categories are all attested. So visual is unmarked, then you have non-visual, you have inference, that's a kind of assumption based on visual evidence or experienced evidence. Then there's another inferential that's a little bit more divorced from actual experienced evidence, and then there's the recorded.
So D must be understood as expression of feeling, not...
Yes, that's right. It should be understood as an expression of feeling or personal opinion. But as I said, this is a somewhat unusual use of the non-visual form, but it's robust in the language. Okay. So we don't have a great deal of time left, so I'm going to just go very quickly through the next two, and just so you can see a little bit, and then come to the last part. Associated motion. So Antoine Guillaume has worked on this extensively and has a beautiful article about it from 2016 in Linguistic Typology, where he talks about the phenomenon in detail and identifies it as a typological category that's relevant in a lot of Amazonian languages. The languages that he has worked on, and a number of languages in the western part of the Amazon, have these really elaborate systems of associated motion. So these are elements that attach to the verb. So they're verbally, he defines them specifically as bound verbal elements that relate to motion associated with the performance of the event, or the event. So Cabinenia has an example of an elaborate system. Ikito, I won't dwell on these examples, but you can look at them later. Here's Antoine's map of the associated motion systems in his sample, and so you can see there's a pretty clear Western clustering of these systems, and some of them very, very complex, which also the super complex areas also cluster. So related to areality, there's clearly a visual pattern that's really obvious. We don't have enough studies. We need more studies of what's actually happening diachronically in these languages by which these elements are coming about, and I'm not aware of much work that really explores that in detail. But I will say that, again, in the languages that I work on, and the non-Hoop languages, there's a lot of use of verb roots in compounds with a kind of associated motion function, although they don't meet Antoine's definition because they also occur as free verb roots. But it looks like you could easily imagine a trajectory in the future where these things would turn into associated motion particles, and they're on the periphery of his area. So, valence adjusting. Again, I'm going to just be very quick here, but again, elaborate systems. Also, relation to incorporation is interesting. So, oops, here's an example of an elaborate system, the Matsugenga. Lots of values. Mary Ruth Wise and Thomas Paine have said that pre-Andine Arawakan languages appear to be some of the most highly developed systems of morphologically distinct applicative operations on Earth. I think there's probably other examples around the world, but they're definitely among the most elaborate systems that we see. Here's Burchell's 2014 study where he looks at 55 South American languages and looks at verbal morphology, in this case, morphological applicatives. And again, you can see there's a lot going on with applicatives in this western part of Amazonia. Again, relating to incorporation and relating to the question of sort of semi-morphological, semi-syntactic functions. There are a lot of examples of Amazonian languages where, as we saw with tense, for example, these elements are not so clearly bound verbal elements all the time. So this form in Padisi, the same form can appear as a postposition or as a verbal suffix. And interestingly, if you look into Arawakan, it's not clear which of these is historically prior. There's arguments that, in fact, you find cognates of both of these, or you find cognates of this form in different Arawakan languages that have both free and bound functions across the family. So it's not clear that this is a sort of recent grammaticalization in Padisi moving towards a bound form. Hoop, same thing, you get these. This one, again, there's an argument for recent grammaticalization in this form, and it's got a semi-detachable character from the verb. With respect to areality, again, we need more work on the diachrony of valence systems, but we find an areal distribution of these systems. And there's evidence from a number of languages that there has been possibly, in some cases, even direct borrowing of valence adjusting forms, although obviously these ta, da suffixes are phonologically short, and they're frequent phonemes, they're frequent meaning calculated segments, so it's unclear, but there's definitely a regional resemblance in forms here that suggests there may have been some direct borrowing. That extends all the way from northern Peru all the way down to Bolivia, so again, a big western swath. So we only have a couple of minutes left, but I want to say a little bit about what some of these patterns might mean in broader terms for Amazonian areal typology. One point that I think is really intriguing is that there seems to be, in a lot of these systems, and in fact, a lot, I would say somewhat impressionistically, in a lot of bound morphology in Amazonian languages in general, there's a great deal of heterogeneity. So it's a sort of standard in historical linguistics that if you want to demonstrate language relationship, one of the most stable things that you would hope to look at is verbal morphology, especially inflectional morphology. But it's not completely clear to me that in these Amazonian languages that those domains are particularly stable. So, for example, in tense, this is a set of tense forms in Arawakan languages, or tense values and forms, and it's evident that they don't have much in common. There's not a lot of cognacy there. And so again, it's an open question to what extent this applies across language families and across domains more generally in Amazonia, but impressionistically, this is something that I see a lot of, that there's just not a lot of evidence for a great deal of stability in verbal morphology, and certainly not in these domains that we've been looking at in some of these languages. So one further point that I think is really interesting relates to the distinction between morphology and syntax in Amazonian languages. So this is work that Adam Tallman, or a point that Adam Tallman's been working on a lot. And so as far back as 1990, when Doris Payne made the observation that in Amazonian languages you find a lot of this kind of flexible positioning of verbal affixes. You get repetitions of the same suffix in a given string. You get some of the indeterminacy of post and sort of variable bonding and stuff that I've shown in some of these other examples. And she points out that the prevalence of compounding and incorporation in the region may feed these processes of grammaticalization and encourage this kind of fuzzy, indeterminate distinction between morphology and syntax in a lot of the languages of the region. One might also go the other way around and say that if you have a fuzzy syntax-morphology distinction, that might be grounds for more grammaticalization to happen. So it seems that you could say there's a two-way relationship. And Doris Payne raised the question, is morphology in these languages more akin to syntax than in Indo-European language? So again, for typology, I think it's a very interesting question. So here's Adam, who's been working on this quite a lot. So again, I think the question of a fuzzy morphology syntax distinction is very relevant to areality, both in terms of being potentially a broadly shared property in the Amazonian languages, but also a property that might encourage the elaboration of various domains in terms of grammatical forms and grammatical domains that might then translate into other areal distributions of other grammatical phenomena. And with respect to theories of morphology, it's also a bit of a challenge to the idea that typologically we see a more discrete distinction between morphology and syntax, which is also an observation that Fernando Zuniga has made about indigenous languages of the Americas more generally. So I think we're out of time. Just summarizing, lots of elaboration in these grammatical domains that I've looked at, and others that I haven't looked at. Lots of evidence for restructuring and diffusion. These questions of maybe low stability of morphology in various domains and various languages, and the question of analytic indeterminacy between morphological and syntactic treatment of elements. So I'll stop this. If there's any questions, we're sort of almost out of time. Yes.
This concept of associated motion is also widespread in African languages, just that African is called primitive marking. And for me, it's part of evidentiality marking strategy, because you can only use it in the language that I know of. When you yourself observe or witness the event, in other words, if you read it out, you're reporting something that you apparently were not involved in yourself, how you didn't see it. So for me, primitive marking or associated motion marking is part of evidentiality marking.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Because I'm worried a bit about the white spots in the African continent again when it comes to evidentiality marking. There's also transaspect marking, which is part of evidentiality marking. You don't find the kind of particles, speakers of Amazonian languages. There are other ways of doing the same, accomplishing the same thing. And so I think we should be careful with claiming that this and this thing, such a thing does not exist in that part of the world.
Absolutely.
Maybe that, maybe the investigator doesn't know it, which is a different thing.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think it's a standard struggle in typology that a lot of our interpretations or understandings come from how we define something. And you have to come up with some sort of operative definition, but in some cases it's missing work that can be accomplished by a variety of means. Well, I guess we're probably really out of time, so thank you.